Marcus had always been the kind of person who valued hard work. Life hadn't always been kind to him, but he had learned to make the most of what he had. For years, he lived in a modest apartment in a part of the city that wasn't exactly the most glamorous. It wasn't a luxury high-rise or a fancy neighborhood with sparkling lights and designer shops. It was a place where people struggled to make ends meet and where survival often took precedence over dreams. Yet, Marcus never complained. He understood the importance of keeping his head down and focusing on his goals. He worked as a mechanic, fixing cars for a living. While many people viewed the job as unimportant or tiring, Marcus took pride in it. Every car he repaired was a little piece of him, a reflection of his skill and commitment. He had big dreams, though. Dreams that had nothing to do with the rough neighborhood he lived in. What most people didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just a regular mechanic. He wasn't living paycheck to paycheck like many of his neighbors. The truth was, he was a millionaire. An undercover millionaire, as he liked to call it. He had accumulated wealth over the years, investing in smart business ventures that no one would ever guess. He kept his money a secret, choosing to live a simple, humble life. The luxury cars, expensive watches, and flashy clothes that most millionaires enjoyed were things he didn't care about. Instead, he dressed simply, drove an old car, and rented a modest apartment in the same building as others. The apartment where Marcus lived was far from perfect. The building was old, and the walls were thin. The pipes often creaked, and the paint was chipped in places. But to him, it wasn't about the apartment. It was about the lifestyle he had chosen. He lived modestly, not out of necessity, but as part of a personal project. He wanted to understand what life was like for people who didn't have the privilege of wealth. He wanted to know how the other half lived, to experience the same struggles, frustrations, and challenges that others faced daily. However, living in a place like this wasn't without its challenges. Marcus had been dealing with a landlord named Mr. Richardson, an older man who owned the building and many others in the area. At first, things were relatively peaceful. Mr. Richardson would drop by now and then to collect rent or inspect the building, but there were never any real issues. That was, until the last few months. It started with small things. Mr. Richardson began acting distant, giving Marcus strange looks whenever they crossed paths. He became more critical of the tenants, singling out Marcus among the others. It was subtle at first. Comments here and there that seemed harmless but felt off. Comments about how things were better in the old days, or how people of certain backgrounds weren't as dependable as others. Marcus tried to shrug it off, telling himself that perhaps it was just an old man's eccentricities, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Soon, the behavior escalated. Mr. Richardson stopped making necessary repairs to the building. The water pressure in the shower was practically non-existent, and the heating system was a disaster during the winter months. When Marcus complained, Richardson would make excuses, telling him there were more important things to focus on. It was clear that the landlord wasn't putting much effort into maintaining the building or ensuring the tenants were comfortable. One evening, after a particularly uncomfortable exchange where Mr. Richardson made a comment about how people like Marcus didn't appreciate what they had, Marcus decided he had enough. Something was wrong, and he wasn't going to let it slide any longer. He had faced many challenges in life, but this was different. He couldn't ignore the signs that his landlord might be treating him unfairly, and perhaps even trying to push him out of the building. Little did Mr. Richardson know, the man he was dealing with wasn't the average tenant he thought he could push around. Marcus wasn't just a man trying to get by. He was someone who had the resources and the determination to fight back if needed. But for now, he chose to remain calm, taking note of every interaction, preparing for what might come next. Marcus didn't want to make a big scene. He wasn't the type to stir up trouble or attract attention to himself. But he knew that the days ahead were going to require more than just patience. The balance between keeping his identity a secret and standing up for his rights was about to shift, and Marcus was ready to face whatever challenge came his way. As the days passed, Marcus found himself more and more uncomfortable in his own home. The subtle remarks and cold attitude from Mr. Richardson were starting to add up. Marcus had been living in the apartment for a few years now, and for the most part, he had gotten along fine with the landlord. But something had shifted in the last few months. Richardson's attitude had turned from friendly indifference to outright disdain, and Marcus could feel the change every time they crossed paths. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, and it gnawed at him each day. At first, Marcus tried to brush it off. After all, it wasn't the first time someone had made him feel uncomfortable because of his background. In the world he lived in, there were plenty of people who thought they were better than others. He had learned to deal with it over the years. But this was different. This wasn't just casual prejudice. It felt calculated, like Mr. Richardson was intentionally trying to push Marcus out of the building. The landlord's behavior had begun to affect the day-to-day running of the apartment. The repairs that used to be done promptly were now delayed, sometimes for weeks. When Marcus had first moved in, everything had been functional, albeit old, but now the place was falling apart. The plumbing was a mess, the paint was peeling off the walls, and the heating barely worked during the cold winter months. It seemed like no matter how many times Marcus reported the issues, Mr. Richardson would find some excuse to delay the repairs. Marcus had always been a patient person, and he hated complaining. But it was hard to ignore the growing sense of frustration. He had a right to live in a safe, comfortable space, just like anyone else. After all, he was paying for it. It wasn't just about the repairs anymore. It was about respect. Marcus felt like Mr. Richardson didn't view him as a tenant who deserved proper treatment. Instead, he was just another face in a building full of people Mr. Richardson didn't care about. One morning, things took a turn for the worse. Marcus had woken up early to find the water pressure in his apartment completely gone. His shower was practically useless, and there was no hot water in the kitchen. When he went down to the landlord's office to report the issue, Mr. Richardson was there as usual. This time, however, he was unusually short with Marcus. "You've got to be kidding me," Mr. Richardson muttered under his breath as Marcus explained the problem. "I'll get to it when I can. You know how it is." But Marcus knew how it was. Mr. Richardson had been making excuses for months. The way he spoke to Marcus was growing colder by the day. The landlord wasn't even trying to hide his distaste anymore. It was clear that this wasn't just about the apartment. It was personal. Marcus had a sinking feeling that Mr. Richardson was using his position of power to make his life miserable. Maybe he thought Marcus would just give up and leave. Maybe he thought that, being one of the few black tenants in the building, Marcus wouldn't have the courage to stand up for himself. The tension was building, and Marcus wasn't sure how long he could continue to ignore it. He didn't want to escalate the situation. He didn't want to get involved in a fight. But at the same time, he couldn't let someone bully him simply because they thought they could get away with it. He had worked too hard to let someone push him around like this. Despite the frustration, Marcus remained calm. He wasn't the type to start conflict, and he wasn't about to let Mr. Richardson see how much this was affecting him. Instead, he took notes. Every conversation with the landlord, every broken promise, every refusal to make repairs, he documented it all. He knew that if this situation escalated, he needed to be prepared. And if things got worse, he wasn't going to let the landlord win. Meanwhile, Marcus went about his daily life, trying to keep things normal. He worked hard at his mechanic job, spending long hours in the garage fixing cars and helping customers. Outside of work, he kept a low profile, spending time in his apartment or out of town on business trips. He didn't talk much about his life outside of work, and he certainly didn't share his financial success with anyone. He liked keeping things simple and private. But behind the scenes, Marcus's mind was working. He had a plan, but it wasn't one that involved confrontation or public outrage. No, Marcus knew that sometimes the best way to fight back was quietly, without drawing attention. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. He couldn't let this man treat him like this anymore. But how could he prove what was going on without making things worse? Days turned into weeks, and Marcus felt the pressure building. It wasn't just the broken pipes or the lack of heating that bothered him now. It was the feeling that something was wrong on a much deeper level. Mr. Richardson's behavior was no longer just an inconvenience. It was becoming a clear pattern of mistreatment. Every day, Marcus felt more like an outsider in a place he was supposed to call home. He began to wonder if the landlord was deliberately targeting him, making his life as difficult as possible. The thought gnawed at him, but he didn't let it show. One afternoon, things took a drastic turn. Marcus came home from work to find a letter stuck to his apartment door. He unfolded it carefully, expecting it to be just another notice about repairs or routine maintenance. But as he read, his stomach sank. The letter was a formal eviction notice. It claimed that Marcus had failed to pay rent for the past month, something that was completely untrue. In fact, Marcus had paid his rent on time every month without fail. The letter went on to say that Marcus had violated the terms of his lease and that he had 30 days to vacate the apartment. The reasons for the eviction were vague, mentioning things like failure to maintain the property and excessive noise complaints, but none of it made any sense. Marcus had never caused any trouble in the building. He didn't throw loud parties or bring attention to himself. In fact, he kept to himself most of the time, quietly working on his cars and keeping a low profile. The letter made it clear that Mr. Richardson wanted him gone, and it was starting to feel personal. Marcus could feel his anger rising, but he fought to keep it under control. He knew that if he let his emotions take over, it would only make things worse. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation into a full-blown confrontation. But this was too much. He had worked hard to get where he was, and he wasn't about to let someone bully him out of his home. As the reality of the situation sank in, Marcus started to think about his options. He had always believed in handling things calmly, with patience and dignity, but this was different. He couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. This was no longer just about a leaky faucet or a broken heater. This was about his rights as a tenant, his dignity as a person, and his ability to live peacefully in a place he had chosen as his home. But what could he do? He knew that getting angry and confronting Mr. Richardson directly would only make things worse. The landlord already had the upper hand, and Marcus wasn't sure what kind of retaliation he could face if he pushed back. He had to think strategically, carefully weighing his next steps. After a long evening of reflecting, Marcus decided to take action. He needed to gather information, concrete evidence that Mr. Richardson had been acting in bad faith. The landlord had been making excuses for months about the repairs, and now the eviction notice seemed like the final straw. Marcus knew he couldn't let this slide, not without a fight. He couldn't just walk away and accept the injustice. But how could he prove that the eviction was based on something other than legitimate reasons? That night, Marcus started making plans. He began documenting everything. Every interaction he'd had with Mr. Richardson, every delay in the repairs, and every unfair treatment. He knew that if he was going to take legal action, he needed to have all his facts straight. He also made a list of other tenants who had experienced similar issues, people who might be willing to speak out about their own experiences with the landlord's mistreatment. Marcus had learned a lot in his years of working in the mechanic shop, especially when it came to solving problems. He wasn't afraid of challenges, and he knew that sometimes the solution to a difficult problem required more than just skill. It required patience, persistence, and the ability to think outside the box. If Mr. Richardson thought he could get away with forcing Marcus out of his apartment, he was in for a big surprise. At the same time, Marcus had to be careful. He didn't want to draw attention to his plan too early. The last thing he wanted was for Mr. Richardson to realize that he was being investigated. So he kept his actions low-key, continuing to live his life as normal while gathering the evidence he needed. Every day, he documented a little more, taking notes and keeping track of the landlord's actions. It wasn't easy, but Marcus was determined. This wasn't just about the apartment anymore. This was about standing up for what was right. As the days passed, the pressure of the situation started to take its toll on Marcus. He found himself more anxious, more alert, watching for signs that Mr. Richardson was making his next move. But he knew he had to keep his cool. The fight ahead would be a long one, but Marcus was prepared to take it on. Marcus spent the next few days gathering his thoughts and figuring out his next steps. The eviction notice was a wake-up call, but he wasn't about to let it define his future. He knew he couldn't just sit back and hope that things would get better on their own. He had to take control of the situation, and that meant doing something he hadn't expected to do: fight back. The more Marcus thought about the situation, the more convinced he became that Mr. Richardson wasn't just an ordinary landlord. This wasn't about repairs or noise complaints. It was personal. The landlord's behavior had been far from professional, and Marcus began to suspect that Mr. Richardson had been using his position to discriminate against tenants, especially those who weren't as easy to deal with as others. It became clear to Marcus that his landlord was trying to push him out because of who he was, not because of any legitimate issues. At first, Marcus wasn't sure how to proceed. He didn't want to make a scene or escalate things unnecessarily. The last thing he wanted was to draw more attention to himself or make Mr. Richardson suspicious of his next move. But Marcus wasn't just an ordinary tenant. Behind his quiet, humble persona was a sharp mind and a wealth of experience in navigating difficult situations. He knew that sometimes the best way to handle an unfair situation was to plan carefully and gather evidence that would make it impossible for anyone to deny the truth. That night, Marcus started to put his plan into action. He went over the documents related to his lease agreement and his rent payments. Everything seemed in order, and there were no red flags. He had always been diligent about paying his rent on time, so he had no idea why Mr. Richardson would accuse him of failing to do so. But Marcus knew that the landlord wasn't going to let him go without a fight. He needed to find a way to turn the tables, to prove that Mr. Richardson's actions were not just wrong but illegal. The first thing Marcus did was begin to document everything. Every phone call, every visit from Mr. Richardson, and every exchange that felt out of place. He started keeping a detailed record of the broken repairs that had been promised and never delivered. He noted down the times when Mr. Richardson had made dismissive comments or treated him unfairly. Marcus knew that if this came down to a legal battle, every little detail would matter. The more information he could gather, the better his chances of exposing the landlord's misconduct. But that wasn't enough. Marcus also began to research tenant rights and landlord laws. He learned that there were strict rules in place to protect tenants from unfair eviction, and that landlords couldn't just kick people out without cause. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus felt more confident that he had the tools to stand up for himself. He was no longer just a mechanic trying to make a living in a tough neighborhood. He was a man who understood the law and wasn't afraid to use it to his advantage. Still, Marcus knew he needed more than just paperwork to win this fight. He needed to find a way to expose Mr. Richardson's behavior to someone who could take action. That's when the idea hit him. Over the years, he had built a network of contacts through his business ventures. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was an investor, a businessman who had experience with real estate and property management. He knew people who could help, people who had the resources and influence to make a difference. One of those people was a lawyer named Sarah, someone Marcus had met through a business deal a few years back. She specialized in tenant rights and had helped other people fight against unjust evictions. Marcus had always kept his distance from her personal life, but he trusted her expertise. After carefully considering his options, he decided to reach out to her. He needed someone who could help him navigate the legal side of this battle and ensure that he wasn't taken advantage of. The next morning, Marcus made the call. He kept the conversation brief, explaining the situation without revealing too much. He didn't want to tip off Mr. Richardson that he was preparing for a legal battle. Sarah agreed to meet with him later in the week to discuss the details and figure out a strategy. Marcus felt a sense of relief, knowing that he was finally taking steps to protect himself. While waiting for his meeting with Sarah, Marcus continued to document everything. He kept track of the days, marking down any new incidents with Mr. Richardson. Each entry felt like another step closer to his goal. He wasn't going to let this man push him around anymore. As the days passed, Marcus could feel the tension building. But this time, he wasn't afraid. He had a plan. He had knowledge. And most importantly, he had the determination to see it through. The day Marcus had been waiting for finally arrived. He met Sarah, the lawyer he'd reached out to, at a small cafe downtown. As soon as they sat down, he could see the concern in her eyes. She had heard the brief details of his situation over the phone. But now, hearing it in person, the gravity of the situation seemed to hit her. Marcus had always been someone who preferred to keep his problems to himself, but now, he needed to lay it all out on the table. He needed help. He explained everything, from the faulty repairs to the eviction notice. He made sure to go over every detail, including the ways Mr. Richardson had treated him over the past few months. Sarah listened intently, taking notes as Marcus spoke. Every now and then, she asked questions to clarify certain points. When he finished, she sat back, thinking for a moment. "This doesn't sound right," Sarah said. "From what you've told me, this is clearly a case of bad faith on the landlord's part. If what you're saying is true, there are several legal issues here. The eviction seems unjust, and the way he's treated you doesn't sit well either." Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had been worried that perhaps he was overreacting, but hearing Sarah's professional opinion reassured him. She explained that under the law, landlords couldn't simply evict tenants without valid reasons. Discrimination, harassment, and failure to make necessary repairs were serious violations. If Marcus could prove that Mr. Richardson had been acting in bad faith, there was a strong case to be made. After discussing the details of the situation, Sarah outlined a plan. First, they would need to gather all the evidence that Marcus had been compiling. The more information they could present, the stronger their case would be. Sarah also suggested reaching out to other tenants in the building who might have experienced similar issues with Mr. Richardson. If they could find others who had been mistreated, it would strengthen the case even further. Marcus felt a sense of empowerment. He wasn't just a tenant being pushed around by a powerful landlord anymore. He was someone with a plan. He had legal resources now, and he knew he wasn't alone in this fight. Together, he and Sarah would make sure that Mr. Richardson was held accountable. Over the next few days, Marcus worked tirelessly to gather everything he could. He combed through old receipts and bank statements to prove that he had always paid his rent on time. He organized his notes and made sure every interaction with Mr. Richardson was documented. But he didn't stop there. He began speaking to other tenants in the building, cautiously at first, to see if anyone else had been treated unfairly. It wasn't easy. Most of the tenants were reluctant to speak up. They were either afraid of retaliation or simply didn't want to get involved in the conflict. But Marcus was persistent. He talked to one tenant, then another, until he found a few who had similar stories to tell. One tenant, a woman named Linda, had been dealing with leaking pipes in her apartment for months. She had reported the issue multiple times, but like Marcus, the repairs were always delayed. Another tenant, a man named Robert, had faced harassment from Mr. Richardson about his late rent payments, despite always paying on time. Slowly but surely, Marcus was building a network of people who had experienced the same mistreatment he had. Sarah was impressed with the evidence Marcus had gathered. Together, they compiled everything into a well-organized case. They had proof that Mr. Richardson had been negligent in maintaining the property, and they had testimonies from other tenants who had been treated unfairly. With Sarah's guidance, Marcus felt more confident than ever that he was on the right track. But even as they moved forward with their plan, Marcus knew that this fight wasn't going to be easy. He could already feel the tension building. Mr. Richardson wasn't the type to back down without a fight, and Marcus could sense that he was about to face the landlord's retaliation. It wasn't just the legal battle that worried him, it was the personal one. Mr. Richardson had made it clear that he didn't want Marcus around, and if the landlord tried to make his life even harder, Marcus needed to be ready. As Marcus and Sarah worked together, the pressure of the situation became more palpable. Every day brought new challenges. Marcus was no longer just a tenant trying to get by. He was someone caught in the middle of a battle for his home, his dignity, and his rights. But he wasn't alone. Sarah was there every step of the way, guiding him through the legal complexities and helping him organize his case. The more they uncovered about Mr. Richardson's behavior, the more they realized how deep the issue ran. The evidence was stacking up. Marcus had gathered testimonies from several other tenants who had suffered similar treatment. One by one, they shared their stories of unfulfilled repair requests, unfair warnings, and even direct mistreatment from Mr. Richardson. Some tenants had been afraid to speak out for fear of losing their homes, but with Marcus leading the charge, they found the courage to stand up. They were all part of the bigger picture now, a picture of a landlord who had been abusing his power for far too long. At the same time, Marcus couldn't ignore the underlying anxiety he felt. The legal battle was getting closer, but so was the possibility of retaliation from Mr. Richardson. Marcus had been careful, making sure he didn't tip the landlord off about the steps he was taking. He had heard stories of landlords who made tenants' lives miserable once they found out someone was fighting back. The thought of being forced to leave his apartment or face more unfair treatment was unsettling, but Marcus knew he had no other choice. He couldn't just sit back and accept what was happening. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been mistreated or taken advantage of. Sarah was practical, always offering calm and clear advice. "We need to stay focused," she reminded him. "We have the law on our side, and the more evidence we have, the stronger our case becomes." She had a way of making Marcus feel like he was part of something much bigger than just his apartment or Mr. Richardson's mistreatment. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been in a similar situation, and that thought made him even more determined. The next step was to send a formal letter to Mr. Richardson, warning him that they were aware of his unlawful actions and that they were prepared to take legal action if necessary. Marcus felt a sense of both excitement and nervousness as he watched Sarah draft the letter. It was a powerful message, one that told the landlord that his attempts to evict Marcus and mistreat the tenants would no longer go unchallenged. Once the letter was sent, it was only a matter of time before Mr. Richardson would have to respond. Days passed, and Marcus felt the weight of uncertainty bearing down on him. Would Mr. Richardson retaliate? Would he ignore the letter and continue with his attempts to evict Marcus? It was hard to predict, and that made Marcus restless. He didn't like feeling like he was waiting for something to happen. But he knew that patience was key. They had taken the first step, and now it was a matter of seeing what Mr. Richardson's next move would be. One morning, Marcus woke up to an unexpected surprise. When he checked his mailbox, he found another letter from Mr. Richardson. His heart raced as he opened it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was a formal response to their warning. At first, Marcus felt a wave of disappointment as he read through it. The landlord denied all accusations and insisted that Marcus was in violation of the lease agreement. But then, Marcus noticed something strange. In the letter, Mr. Richardson made a subtle but clear threat, one that suggested he might try to expedite the eviction process by involving a third party. It wasn't direct, but it was a warning nonetheless. Marcus felt a surge of determination. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mr. Richardson was trying to intimidate him, but Marcus wasn't going to back down. He had Sarah on his side, and he had a solid case. The more he thought about the landlord's response, the more it became clear to Marcus that Mr. Richardson wasn't used to tenants fighting back. He had always been able to get away with mistreatment in the past, but now he had met his match. But Marcus had a newfound sense of strength. He knew that he was doing the right thing. Even though the tension was mounting, Marcus found some comfort in knowing that he was doing everything he could. With Sarah's guidance and the support of the other tenants, he was ready to take the next step. The battle was far from over, but Marcus was no longer afraid. He had learned to face challenges head-on, and now he was more determined than ever to win. But now he was someone who understood his rights, someone who was willing to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And that made him stronger than he had ever been before. As the weeks passed, the tension between Marcus and Mr. Richardson intensified. Every time Marcus entered his apartment or walked through the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The landlord was growing increasingly impatient, and Marcus knew that the next steps in their legal battle would be crucial. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes now, not when so much was at stake. Sarah had been a steady presence throughout this process, keeping Marcus focused and helping him stay organized. She worked tirelessly on the legal side of things, ensuring that every document was in order and that they were fully prepared for whatever Mr. Richardson might try next. The tenants who had joined Marcus in speaking out against the landlord's actions were also becoming more involved. Slowly, more and more people were willing to take a stand, and the landlord's past actions were beginning to catch up with him. One evening, Marcus received a call from Sarah. She had some important news. A court date had been set. It was the moment they had been working toward, the day when they would finally be able to present their case. Sarah had managed to secure a slot for their hearing, and now they had to be ready. The time for gathering evidence was over. It was time to go to court. Marcus felt a mixture of emotions. There was relief that they had made it this far, but also a sense of nervousness. He had never imagined that he would be involved in a legal case like this, but he wasn't the same man he had been when all of this started. He had learned so much about his rights, about the law, and about how to stand up for himself. He knew that he was ready, but the idea of going head-to-head with Mr. Richardson in a courtroom was intimidating. In the days leading up to the court date, Marcus continued to work with Sarah, going over their strategy and making sure everything was in place. They went over the evidence again, his rent receipts, the testimonies from other tenants, the correspondence with Mr. Richardson, and the formal letter they had sent. Everything was carefully organized. But even more importantly, Marcus had built a sense of confidence in the truth of his case. He wasn't fighting with assumptions or guesses. He was fighting with facts. On the day of the hearing, Marcus couldn't help but feel nervous as he walked into the courthouse. The building was imposing, and the quiet bustle of legal professionals moving in and out of the halls made him feel small. But he reminded himself that he wasn't just any tenant. He was a man who had the truth on his side. He had done nothing wrong, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel otherwise. Sarah met him outside the courtroom and gave him a reassuring smile. "You've got this," she said, her confidence lifting his spirits. Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. He had no idea what to expect from the hearing, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat with Sarah as they waited for the proceedings to begin. His heart pounded as Mr. Richardson walked in, flanked by his lawyer. The landlord looked much more confident than he had any right to be, considering the situation. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. He had learned to stay calm under pressure, and now was no different. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The hearing began with both sides presenting their cases. Sarah went first, explaining the situation clearly and concisely. She laid out all the evidence they had gathered, from the broken repairs to the eviction notice, and presented the testimonies from the other tenants who had been mistreated. She didn't waste any time or energy trying to make Mr. Richardson look bad. She simply stuck to the facts. It was clear that the landlord's actions had been both unjust and illegal. Then it was Mr. Richardson's turn. He tried to argue that Marcus had been a problematic tenant, claiming that the repairs had been delayed because of Marcus' lack of cooperation. His lawyer attempted to paint him as a victim of a difficult, uncooperative tenant who had caused problems in the building. But his arguments fell flat. Sarah had already anticipated his defense and was ready with counterarguments that exposed the inconsistencies in his claims. As the hearing continued, Marcus couldn't help but notice how Mr. Richardson's demeanor shifted. At first, the landlord had been confident, even smug. But as the evidence mounted against him, he seemed to grow more defensive, his voice growing sharper and his body language tense. Marcus could see that the landlord was starting to realize that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. He wasn't dealing with someone who would back down just because he had power or influence. Marcus wasn't going anywhere without a fight. After the court ruling, Marcus couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The weight that had been on his shoulders for so long suddenly felt lighter, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. The court had ruled in his favor, and the landlord was required to make the repairs and reverse the eviction notice. Marcus had won. He had fought back, and the law had protected him. The news spread quickly. Sarah had called him right after the verdict to congratulate him. "You did it, Marcus," she said with genuine excitement. "You fought for your rights, and you've set a great example for others. This is a huge win." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't experienced before. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a message to anyone who felt powerless. If he could stand up for himself and win, so could others. He had shown that the fight against injustice was worth every bit of effort. And now he felt empowered in a way he never had before. The next few days were filled with celebrations from the tenants in the building. Many had been watching the case closely, and now that Marcus had won, they were eager to see real change. Mr. Richardson had no choice but to follow the court's orders. He had to fix the issues in the building and end the wrongful eviction attempts. Some of the tenants, who had been too afraid to speak out before, now felt encouraged. They saw Marcus' victory as proof that standing up to unfair treatment could make a difference. Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope for his community. Before this experience, he had often felt like just another tenant, stuck in a building full of problems. But now he realized that change was possible, even in the most difficult of circumstances. It wasn't just about fixing broken pipes or unfair evictions. It was about creating an environment where people could stand up for what they deserved. Over the following weeks, things began to change. The repairs that had been delayed for so long were finally made. The building, which had been a source of frustration and anxiety for Marcus and his neighbors, began to feel like a more comfortable place to live. The landlord, now forced to follow the law, began acting more professionally. The tenants who had once been hesitant to get involved were now more vocal about their rights, and they started to report issues that had been ignored for years. Marcus' victory had sparked a sense of unity in the building, and people were beginning to realize that they didn't have to put up with bad treatment. But Marcus wasn't content to stop there. He realized that there were still others out there who were going through similar struggles. He had been fortunate to have had the support of Sarah, but not everyone had access to a lawyer who was willing to help. So Marcus decided to take his experience even further. He began speaking to local community groups and offering advice to tenants who were facing similar issues with their landlords. He shared his story, explaining how important it was to know your rights and how standing up to unfair practices could lead to real change. Sarah was impressed when she heard about Marcus' efforts to help others. "You've really turned this into something bigger than yourself," she told him. "You're not just a survivor of bad circumstances. You're helping to make sure no one else has to go through what you did. That's incredible." Marcus didn't see himself as anything special. He just knew that he had been in a difficult position, and he had managed to get through it by staying focused and refusing to give up. He had learned that sometimes the biggest change comes from taking a stand, no matter how daunting the challenge might seem. Months later, Marcus walked into his apartment building with a sense of accomplishment. The air felt different now, lighter, more positive. His relationship with the landlord had shifted too. While Mr. Richardson was still reluctant to be friendly, he no longer harassed the tenants, and the issues in the building were getting addressed. Things weren't perfect, but they had improved, and Marcus knew that he had played a significant part in that change. He walked up to his apartment, the same one he had once feared losing. As he opened the door, he felt a sense of gratitude. He had fought for his home, and in doing so, he had found something far more valuable. a sense of self-respect and empowerment that would stay with him forever. Marcus had learned the true meaning of standing up for yourself, and he had discovered that, sometimes, the fight for justice can lead to far-reaching changes, even in the most difficult situations. What began as a struggle for his own home turned into a larger movement, one that showed the power of persistence, unity, and belief in doing what's right.